The sun had begun its descent, painting the evening sky with hues of orange and pink. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the towering trees lining the empty road. It was a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city where life moved at a slower pace. The occasional chirping of birds and the distant hum of vehicles on the highway were the only sounds breaking the silence. Old Joseph walked down the familiar path leading to his small cottage. He was in his late 70s, his steps slow and deliberate. His wrinkled face carried the weight of years spent in solitude. His wife had passed away a decade ago, and his children had moved far away, caught up in the whirlwind of their own lives. Now, his only companion was silence. As he walked, he pulled his coat tighter around his frail body. The early winter breeze sent shivers down his spine. His cane tapped softly against the pavement with each step, a rhythm that had become second nature to him. But just as he turned the corner near the old park, something unusual caught his attention. A faint whimper. Joseph stopped, his brows furrowing. He tilted his head, listening intently. Another whimper. A sound filled with pain and desperation. His gaze shifted toward the roadside, where a small figure lay curled up against the pavement, barely visible in the dim light of the setting sun. As he took a few cautious steps closer, his heart clenched at the sight before him. It was a Doga golden retriever, to be exact. Its fur was matted and dirty, and there was a visible wound on its hind leg. The poor creature whimpered again, trying to move but failing. Joseph felt a pang of sorrow. He had never been much of an animal person, but he couldn't ignore the helplessness in the dog's eyes. He knelt slowly, ignoring the protest of his old joints. "Hey there, buddy," he said gently, his voice soft. The dog flinched slightly at his approach, but did not try to run. Joseph carefully extended his hand, allowing the dog to sniff him. After a hesitant moment, the retriever licked his fingers weakly. "You're hurt, aren't you?" Joseph murmured, his heart aching. He could see the dried blood on the dog's fur. It must have been hit by a passing vehicle and left to fend for itself. He sighed, knowing he couldn't leave the animal here. With slow yet determined movements, he removed his scarf and gently wrapped it around the dog's injured leg to stop any further bleeding. "This is going to be a little tricky, but I'll take you home, okay?" he said, as if expecting a response. With great effort, Joseph lifted the dog into his arms. The retriever let out a soft yelp but soon relaxed against his chest. The walk back home was slow and careful. Joseph could feel the dog's body trembling, either from fear or exhaustion or both. Upon reaching his cottage, he placed the dog gently on an old but warm blanket in front of the fireplace. He then fetched a bowl of water and some leftover chicken from his dinner. "Eat up, buddy. You need your strength," Joseph said as he placed the food in front of him. The dog hesitated for a moment, then sniffed the bowl. Hunger overpowered its fear, and soon it was devouring the meal eagerly. Joseph watched, a small smile tugging at his lips. It had been a long time since he had shared his home with someone. "You need a name," he mused aloud. "How about Max?" The dog paused, tilting its head slightly. "Max it is," Joseph said with a chuckle. That night, as Joseph settled into his chair with a book, Max curled up near his feet, sighing contentedly. For the first time in years, Joseph didn't feel so alone. The following morning, a soft ray of sunlight peeked through the old wooden window, casting a golden glow over the cozy living room. The crackling embers in the fireplace had long since turned to ashes, but warmth still lingered in the air. Joseph stirred in his chair, blinking against the morning light. His old bones ached slightly from sleeping in a seated position, but he hardly noticed. His gaze immediately fell to the floor near his feet, where Max lay curled up, his chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. For a brief moment, Joseph feared it had all been a dream, that the injured dog he had rescued was nothing but a figment of his loneliness. But when Max shifted, Letting out a contented sigh, Joseph smiled. "You're still here, buddy," he murmured. Max opened his eyes at the sound of Joseph's voice, his tail thumping weakly against the wooden floor. Joseph stretched his stiff limbs before slowly rising to his feet. "All right, let's see about that leg of yours," he said, kneeling beside Max. The makeshift bandage he had wrapped around Max's wounded leg was stained with dried blood. The injury was still raw, and Joseph knew that if he didn't do something soon, an infection could set in. "I suppose we'll have to make a trip to town today," Joseph muttered, ruffling Max's head gently. He hadn't been to town in quite some time, only when necessary. His world had become small, confined to the little cottage at the edge of the woods. The grocery store owner knew him by name, and the postman was the only other person who occasionally stopped by. But today was different. He had a reason to go. After feeding Max a light breakfast of bread soaked in warm milk, Joseph bundled himself up in his old coat and scarf. The winter chill was settling in, and he didn't want to risk catching a cold. He fashioned a small carrier out of a wicker basket lined with blankets, making sure Max would be comfortable during the journey. The retriever, though still weak, allowed himself to be gently placed inside without protest. The walk to town was slow. Joseph took careful steps along the uneven path, his cane tapping against the ground as he carried Max in his arms. Though his muscles ached under the weight, he didn't complain. As they approached the main road leading to the town's center, the sounds of daily life grew louder. Children laughed as they played near the bakery, the scent of fresh bread wafting through the air. Vendors called out to potential customers, advertising their goods. It was a small town, but it had a heart, full of warmth and familiarity. A few townspeople noticed Joseph and the small bundle he carried. Some greeted him with a nod, while others stole curious glances at the dog resting in his arms. "Morning, Joseph," called out Mr. Higgins, the town grocer. He was a stocky man with a kind face, always ready with a friendly smile. His gaze fell to the injured retriever, and his expression softened. "Who's your new friend?" "This is Max," Joseph said, adjusting his grip on the basket. "Found him injured by the roadside yesterday. Thought I'd take him to the vet." Mr. Higgins nodded approvingly. "Good man. Old Doc Reynolds should be at the clinic. He'll know what to do." Joseph thanked him and continued toward the small veterinary clinic at the far end of the street. The bell above the door chimed as Joseph stepped inside. The clinic was modest, with a few chairs lining the walls and shelves stocked with medicine and pet care supplies. Dr. Reynolds, an elderly veterinarian with silver hair and kind eyes, emerged from a back room, wiping his hands on a towel. "Joseph," he greeted, surprised. "It's been a while since I've seen you in here." Joseph nodded, carefully setting the basket down on the examination table. "I need your help, Doc. Found this poor soul injured on the roadside." Dr. Reynolds peered inside, his expression turning serious as he examined Max's leg. The retriever let out a small whimper but remained still. Looks like he was either hit by a vehicle or got caught in something sharp," the doctor observed. "It's not too deep, but it needs cleaning and stitches. He's lucky you found him." Joseph watched anxiously as Dr. Reynolds cleaned the wound with practiced hands. Max flinched slightly but didn't resist. After some time, the doctor stepped back, nodding in satisfaction. "There. He should heal up nicely. Just keep him warm, give him soft food, and make sure he doesn't put too much weight on that leg for a while." Relief washed over Joseph. "Thank you, Doc." Dr. Reynolds waved him off. "No charge, just take care of him." Joseph looked at Max, who was now resting comfortably with fresh bandages around his leg. He reached out and gently stroked the retriever's head. "I will," he promised. The journey back home was slower. The weight of the day was beginning to settle into Joseph's old bones, but he didn't mind. Every so often, he glanced down at Max, who looked up at him with grateful eyes. For the first time in years, Joseph felt something stir within him, something he had almost forgotten, a sense of purpose, When they finally reached the cottage, Joseph set Max down on the blanket near the fireplace once again. The dog let out a contented sigh, as if he finally felt safe. Joseph chuckled. "Well, I suppose we're stuck with each other now." Max thumped his tail against the floor in response. As Joseph settled into his chair that evening, he realized that his house no longer felt so empty. The quiet wasn't lonely anymore, was peaceful. He glanced down at Max, who had already fallen asleep, his injured leg stretched out comfortably. Joseph smiled. For the first time in years, he didn't feel so alone. The days slowly turned into weeks, and life at the little cottage settled into a comfortable rhythm. The winter outside grew harsher, with the wind howling through the trees and frost forming intricate patterns on the window panes. But inside the cottage, warmth blossomed not just from the fire in the hearth, but from the companionship that had taken root between Joseph and Max. Max's leg, though still healing, was improving with each passing day. He had gone from barely moving to limping around the house, following Joseph wherever he went. If Joseph went to the kitchen, Max would hobble after him, his tail wagging excitedly. If Joseph sat by the window to read his newspaper, Max would curl up beside him, resting his head on the old man's foot. "You've got some spirit, I'll give you that," Joseph muttered one morning as he sipped his tea, watching Max attempt to put more weight on his injured leg. The dog stumbled slightly but steadied himself, looking up at Joseph with determined eyes. Joseph chuckled. "Stubborn, aren't you?" Max barked once in agreement. Outside, the world was covered in a thick layer of snow, blanketing everything in white. It had been years since Joseph had cared about the seasons. Winter was just another stretch of cold loneliness, but this year was different. The cottage didn't feel so empty anymore. One bright morning, as the sun peeked over the horizon, Joseph bundled himself up in his thick coat, woolen hat, and scarf. He looked over at Max, who was now standing near the door, his tail wagging with anticipation. "You sure you're up for this, boy?" Joseph asked, raising an eyebrow. Max barked and took a confident step forward. His leg was still weak, but he wasn't letting it stop him. Joseph nodded approvingly. "All right then, let's go." For the first time in years, Joseph found himself stepping out of the house with a companion by his side. The world outside was crisp and quiet, the snow crunching under their feet. Max sniffed the air excitedly, taking in the scents of the woods and the fresh morning breeze. They walked at a slow pace, Joseph keeping an eye on Max to make sure he didn't overexert himself. It felt strange at first to be out on a morning stroll after so long, but it felt right. He had spent too many years confined to the solitude of his cottage, letting life pass him by. But with Max beside him, it felt as if he had been given a second chance. As they walked through the snow-covered trail, Joseph found himself talking for the first time in years. "You know, Max," he began, adjusting his scarf. "I used to walk these paths every day, with my wife." He sighed, looking ahead as memories flooded his mind. She loved the outdoors, said nature had a way of making the heart lighter. Max looked up at him, his amber eyes filled with quiet understanding. Joseph chuckled softly. I think she was right. For the first time in years, Joseph wasn't walking alone. As the days went by, Max continued to heal, both physically and emotionally. When Joseph had first found him, he had been wary, hesitant and abandoned soul, unsure of whether he could trust again. But now, he was opening up, allowing himself to feel safe, to love, and to be loved in return. One evening, as Joseph sat by the fire, reading a worn-out book, he felt a soft nudge against his hand. He looked down to find Max pressing his head against him, seeking comfort. Joseph smiled and set his book aside. "What's the matter, boy?" Max let out a soft whine, his eyes filled with emotion. Joseph reached out and gently stroked his fur. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" he murmured. "But you're safe now. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Max let out a contented sigh and rested his head on Joseph's lap. The old man felt a lump rise in his throat. He had spent so many years longing for companionship, and now here was this dog, this resilient, beautiful creature, who had found his way into his life, into his heart. "Guess we both needed saving, huh?" Joseph whispered. Max thumped his tail against the floor in response, and in that quiet moment, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the gentle heartbeat of his newfound friend, Joseph realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't lonely anymore. The bond between Joseph and Max grew stronger with each passing day. The once wounded dog had now regained much of his strength, his injured leg nearly healed, and his spirit fully restored. He was no longer the scared, broken creature Joseph had found on the roadside. He was lively, playful, and full of energy, his amber eyes glowing with trust and affection. Joseph, too, had changed. He no longer woke up to silence and spent his days lost in thoughts of the past. His world, which had once been cold and empty, was now warm and full of life. For the first time in years, he had a reason to get up in the morning, a reason to keep going. Their days were filled with simple joys, long walks through the forest, quiet evenings by the fire, and moments of laughter when Max would chase his own tail or bury himself in the pile of blankets on the couch. But life, as always, had its way of testing the strongest bonds. One evening, as Joseph prepared dinner, the wind outside howled through the trees, rattling the windows. Dark clouds gathered overhead, and soon the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping against the glass like impatient fingers. Max, who had been lying by the fireplace, lifted his head, his ears perking up. He let out a low growl, sensing something in the air. Joseph glanced at him. "What's the matter, boy?" A loud clap of thunder rumbled through the sky, shaking the cottage. Max jumped to his feet, his body tense. Joseph chuckled, walking over to ruffle his fur. "It's just a storm, Max. Nothing to be afraid of." But Max wasn't afraid, he was alert. He trotted to the door, sniffing around before letting out a series of short, urgent barks. Joseph frowned. It wasn't like Max to act this way. Then, without warning, a sharp pain shot through Joseph's chest. His breath hitched, and his vision blurred. He clutched his chest, staggering backward, knocking over the chair behind him. Max barked louder, rushing to his side. Joseph gasped for air, his body trembling as he collapsed onto the floor. The pain was unbearable, a crushing weight pressing down on him. His mind screamed for help, but his voice was barely a whisper. "Max!" he choked out. Max whined, nudging him, but Joseph couldn't move. Then, in a flash, Max sprang into action. Max knew something was terribly wrong. He had seen pain before, had felt it himself when he lay wounded on the roadside. And now, his human was in trouble. His instincts took over. He rushed to the door, jumping up and scratching at it frantically. When that didn't work, he ran to the window and barked at the top of his lungs, desperate to get someone's attention. Outside, the rain poured heavily, the wind howling through the trees. The nearest neighbor lived miles away, and Joseph had no family nearby. Max had to find help, and fast. Determined, he did the only thing he could think of. He bolted out through the back door, which had been left slightly ajar. His paws pounded against the wet ground as he sprinted down the narrow path leading to the main road. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the darkness for just a second. In that brief moment, Max spotted something in the distance, a set of headlights approaching through the storm. A car. Max didn't hesitate. He ran straight toward the road, barking as loudly as he could, his voice cutting through the raging storm. The driver, startled by the sudden sight of a dog in the middle of the road, slammed on the brakes. The car skidded slightly before coming to a stop. A man stepped out, shielding his eyes against the rain. "What in the world?" he started, but then he saw Max, drenched and desperate, barking and running back toward the path. It didn't take long for the man to understand. "Someone needs help," he muttered, following the determined dog. The stranger followed Max back to the cottage, where Joseph lay motionless on the floor. The man immediately pulled out his phone and called for an ambulance. "Hang in there, old man," he murmured, kneeling beside Joseph. "Help is on the way." Max whimpered, nudging Joseph's face gently. Minutes felt like hours, but finally the sound of sirens pierced through the storm. Paramedics rushed in, quickly assessing the situation before loading Joseph onto a stretcher. As they carried him to the ambulance, one of the paramedics turned to the stranger and asked, "How did you know he needed help?" The man glanced at Max, who stood by Joseph's side, refusing to move. "I didn't," he said. "His dog did." Max sat outside the hospital, his fur still damp from the rain. He had followed the ambulance all the way, refusing to leave Joseph alone. The hours dragged on, and Max remained where he was, his amber eyes fixed on the doors, waiting for his human to come back. The storm had passed, but inside Max's heart, a different kind of storm, Regita storm, of worry, of fear, of hope. Would Joseph wake up? Would he be okay? Max didn't understand the world of humans, the machines, the hospital beds, or the doctors. But he understood one thing: he couldn't lose Joseph. Not now, not ever. The hospital hallways smelled of antiseptic, the air thick with a low hum of beeping monitors and hushed voices. Nurses moved swiftly from one room to another, tending to patients in the quiet hours of the night. Outside, the world was still recovering from the storm, the roads wet, the trees swaying gently in the lingering breeze. But none of that mattered to Max. He sat at the entrance of the hospital, his body curled up near the doors, eyes fixed on the place where Joseph had disappeared hours ago. The rain had long stopped, yet Max remained drenched, his fur clinging to his body. But he didn't care. He didn't move. He didn't whimper. He just waited and waited. As the first rays of the sun peeked through the clouds, a young nurse stepped outside to catch some fresh air. She stretched, yawning, and then froze when she spotted the golden-furred dog sitting by the doors. "You're still here?" she murmured, crouching down. She had noticed him last night too, but assumed he'd leave once the rain stopped. Yet here he wasn't, loyal, unwavering. The nurse sighed. She had seen stories like this before, stories of animals refusing to leave their loved ones behind. "Poor thing," she whispered, reaching out a hand. But Max didn't respond. His eyes were still fixed on the doors, his heart still waiting. Just then, another nurse walked out and called to her. "The old man from the emergency room, Joseph Bennett's awake." Max's ears perked up. His head snapped toward the woman. The young nurse blinked. "Really?" "Yeah, the doctors say he had a mild heart attack. He's stable now, though." Lucky too if help had come even a little later. Things could have been much worse. Max didn't need to understand the words. He could hear it in their voices, could sense the shift in their tones. Joseph was alive, and that was all he needed to know. Inside the hospital room, Joseph blinked slowly, adjusting to the bright light. His chest still felt heavy, his body weak, but he was alive. That much he knew. His mind was hazy, but one thought stood out, sharp and clear. Max. Where was Max? Was he okay? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A nurse peeked in, smiling. "Mr. Bennett, you have a visitor." Joseph frowned, confused until the door opened fully and bolted a streak of golden fur. "Max!" The dog leaped onto the bed with surprising gentleness, burying his face against Joseph's chest. His tail wagged furiously, his body trembling with relief. Joseph chuckled, though the sound was hoarse, and lifted a frail hand to stroke Max's head. "You clever boy! You saved my life, didn't you?" Max whined, licking Joseph's hand as if to scold him for scaring him like that. The nurse smiled. "Your dog refused to leave the hospital all night. He's been waiting for you." Joseph swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He looked down at Max, his faithful companion, his rescuer, his family. "Well, I guess that makes us even," he murmured, ruffling the dog's ears. Max huffed, settling beside Joseph, his head resting on his lap. He wasn't going anywhere, not now, not ever. A few days later, Joseph was discharged. Though still weak, he felt stronger with each passing day. The townspeople, upon hearing the story of how Max had saved Joseph's life, treated the dog like a local hero. The storekeeper at the grocery shop gave him free treats. The children at the park gathered around to pet him. Even the grumpy old neighbor who never spoke much gave Max an approving nod. But for Joseph, Max was more than just a hero. He was a friend, a protector, a family member. The days that followed were slower. Joseph had to take things easy and listen to his doctor's orders. But through it all, Max never left his side. Whether it was a short walk in the garden or simply sitting by the porch, they were together, and that was all that mattered. A love that lasts forever. One evening, as Joseph sat by the fireplace, a book resting on his lap, Max curled up beside him, their breaths in sync. Joseph looked down at his companion, a smile touching his lips. "You know, boy, I used to think I was alone in this world, that my time had passed, that I had nothing left to look forward to." Max's ears twitched at his voice, though his eyes remained closed. "But then you came along, and now I can't imagine a day without you." Max let out a contented sigh, nuzzling closer. Joseph chuckled softly. "You're more than just a dog, Max. You're family." The fire crackled, casting a warm glow around the room. Outside, the world continued. Seasons would change, and years would pass. But inside that little cottage, in the heart of an old man and a once lost dog, one truth remained constant. They had found each other, and nothing, not time, not storms, not even the trials of life could ever break their bond. They were home, together, forever.